All right, so today we're going to be talking about the possible principles. Oh, there we go. Possible principles underlying the transformations of sensory messages by H.B. Barlow. This is an older paper that came out in 1961. And the reason I'm interested in this is because in the last video I went over, I talked about something called VicReg in the JEPA paper. I said, "Oh, this is just an implementation of JEPA. It's really not all that interesting." But I started reading it and I've kind of changed my mind. I think it's pretty interesting. And VicReg is actually an improvement on another thing called the Barlow Twins, which was actually co-written by Yolnica. Uh, and the whole idea of Barlow, the idea of twins is less important. Let's just to say there's two networks. The whole thing of Barlow comes from the idea. Here we go. Comes from the idea that Barlow presents in, I think, this paper. I think this is one of the first things to actually happen, or the first time it's been presented. So Barlow was a man who worked on the optical systems of frogs. And he began to realize that if you focus on one small subsystem and you zoom in and you zoom in and you zoom in and you learn everything you possibly can, maybe that's not the best way to go about it. Maybe that's not the best way to get a holistic view of what's actually going on. So what if we actually took this to be a wildly different way of looking at it? Maybe he thought we're losing the forest for the trees. And what we need to do is imagine the entire situation in which this thing is being used. So what he's proposing is that we consider our agent to be set in an environment, and the environment is going to provide some stimulus to the agent. The agent will take that and then produce some output based on the input. Of course, this is something very familiar to us today, but I think this is the paper in which it was actually presented, which I find to be really interesting. So, I really like Barlow's style of writing. He does this thing to where he has really good examples that I really do enjoy, and he writes this in such a way that it's very it's very enjoyable to read. And he will present an idea, then it will present an example, then idea, example, idea, example, and it's very clear. It's very well, I think elucidated is the right word, but I really am not so sure. But let's start out with this first sentence that I'm highlighting over and over again. A wing would be a most mystifying structure if one did not know that birds flew. Here he is saying that we are losing the forest for the trees. He is saying that if you take a wing and you forget everything you know about birds and you only could look at the wing, you probably wouldn't be able to figure out that birds fly. You'd be able to say it is covered in feathers. You'd be able to say it has powerful muscles and strength and lightness are prominent features. But getting a better microscope might not give you a better understanding of its use cases and why it exists and what are the important parts. So here we're actually going to go and propose this idea that we have the agent in an environment. We're going to call the agent the sensory relays. Now, this is kind of a strange way to call an agent, but what we're actually going to be doing is going from the biological view of cells and all this kind of stuff, and we are actually going to kind of take a step back and try to take an abstraction from that and apply what we know about information theory to this idea to say what we can say about incoming messages and sensory relays for those incoming messages in some sort of code. And this code is going to differentiate between passwords. And this is super cool, the marriage between information theory and biology. I absolutely adore that. The information theory that it links to had actually been written like 10 years prior. So this paper came out in 61, and he links to the paper by Shannon and Weaver in 1949 for information theory of information traveling through a fiber. And I think that's just absolutely wonderful that it was just 10 years back. All these things feel so far away these days. But to see that, like, where these things came from and how close everything was together, I find really interesting. So the sensory relays are, we can think of it just as an agent, or we can think of the sensory relay as a convolutional neural network. There's going to be some incoming message, which is going to be an image. Uh, and that image is going to differentiate between, is this image a cat, or does it contain a cat, or does it contain a dog? And the kernels are going to parse this image, and the image is going to contain some password. Of course, the environment is going to provide the stimulus here. So, well, I mean, you could make it work any way you want. The paper came out in 61. We are dealing with very different problems today, so imagine it any way you enjoy. Also, sensory relay is extremely vague. You can think of it like literally as like an operator on a matrix, as we're thinking about right now with the convolutional neural network. Or you could imagine it as yourself in an environment, as he was a biologist studying living things. So he keeps this extremely vague. It says it here. He keeps it extremely vague on purpose so that it could fit a very, very wide variety of situations. So you're going to have your convolutional neural network, which is going to be your sensory relays, and you're going to have your image, which is your incoming message. And your kernels are going to differentiate between whether there is a cat or a dog in the image based on some specific significance. And there's filters and stuff like that with past characteristics. I think the pass characteristics are talking about like high pass or low pass. There's filters which get rid of the vast majority of information, as we might be familiar with whenever we were talking about the JEPA thing. The whole JEPA thing is the idea that we want to get rid of the right information to be able to say more about the information we have. And then these things are going to be there's not going to be some trivial thing. This is going to be recoded, and something is going to happen so that the agent can take some action inside of the environment in some sensible way. That is the whole idea that we're going to be looking at. But this is basically in biological terms. And what we're going to do is we're going to take this, we're going to look at it a little bit. We're going to explain the whole idea, and then we're going to cast it into the light of information theory and see if there's a little bit of nuance that falls out of it. And the answer is there absolutely is, and it is wonderful, and it is something that I would not have known about if I had not like searched up this old paper based on the things that I showed you, the papers I showed you just a second ago. So let's talk about that. We are going to have the first idea is the password hypothesis. And the password hypothesis is going to be this idea that the environment has so much information, but you only care about a little bit of it. If you take a frog, the frog has its entire environment around it, but it only really cares about the fly because it wants the fly. So what's going to happen is the frog is going to see the fly, and that fly is going to be the password. The password will be presented to the agent, which is the frog, and the frog, seeing the fly, will understand this based on some past characteristics and throw away everything that isn't the fly and focus on the fly. Its visual system will maybe take some actions. I don't know, maybe it turns towards the frog and hops towards it and gets the fly. So that's going to be the whole idea of what we're doing. And we're going to say that this password hypothesis is going to break itself up into discrete finite classes. Oh, my microphone is popping. I do hope you can just ignore that. If you can't, I do. Oh, there you go. I guess you're already gone if you can't ignore it. Uh, so he's going to talk about how he wants to break this up into specific classes by the cutaneous stimuli eliciting flexion, which is just movement, and withdrawal in the spinal cat, which I find testing on animals to actually be vaguely abhorrent. But this man was studying the optical nerves of frogs. This was just part of what he did, even though I firmly disagree with it these days. So he's saying that he can split it because the feeling of pain and the feeling of tickling are very vastly different, even though the actual stimuli might not be that different. So what we're going to do is we're going to take specific stimuli and we're going to use this password hypothesis to put them into specific classes. And these classes are going to be the things that we're actually trying to find. The better we can put things into classes, the better we can find what set of outputs do we want to have. What is the best output for the current situation that we find ourselves in today? And so that is going to be the idea of the password, the idea that specific stimuli are going to output specific responses because the password decides, hey, what situation are we in and what output should we have? So as we scroll down, we're going to find the control pass characteristic hypothesis, which is just, like I said before, high pass, low pass. It's deciding what information to get rid of. And of course, it's a little bit more complicated than just turning a stupid knob. It's a little bit more complicated than just changing a single weight. No, no, you're changing at least 20 weights. This is an MLP that we're talking about at this point. I just find it hilarious that he talks about the analogy of a volume or gain control because the MLP was actually presented before this paper came out. The idea of the MLP came out around 1953, if I remember what I googled correctly. But it wasn't physically built for some years. But this paper came out like about a decade after in '61. I wonder if Barlow knew about the perceptron, but it's hard to tell these days. I would have to like Google it or something. I don't know. So let's see. So we are talking about the control pass characteristics, and it's going to be just a little bit more complicated than just turning a knob. So we have to be able to tell what is important and what is not important, and get rid of the things that aren't important. We just need to throw that information away. So we're going to need some kind of system feedback. So what we want to do is we want to say that we have some set of codes, and the codes are going to be able to differentiate. Well, let me scroll down. I think it's near the bottom. Uh, Here we go, this paragraph. So we want to be able to take some specific codes, and these codes are going to be able to differentiate between our important passwords. And what we want also is that the passwords, no, I'm sorry, the codes can be removed. So we're going to have some kind of selective process like natural selection, to where if you have a good code that can tell between the passwords well, that's going to stay. But if it's not that good, it's going to be replaced. So you consistently find good ways of replacing your codes with better codes. That way you can be better and better and better. So let's talk about this redundancy reduction hypothesis. And so this actually gets into a bit of the heart of the, well, why this is really cool. Because what we have is something called economy of thought. There we go, economy of thought, which is the idea that thought is really expensive. It costs energy to think, so we want to do that as little as possible. So, how are we going to make something that spends the minimum amount of energy but gives us the maximum amount of, or minimum amount of redundancy, I should say? Where redundancy, I'm just going to say that the way I understand it is redundancy is the opposite of efficiency. We're trying to maximize the efficiency of what we have. If we have the tools, oh, here's the link for Shannon and Weaver, by the way. If we have the tools, then we should use the tools at our disposal, and we want to make the most of them. And so we want to be as efficient as possible, or say that we want to minimize our redundancy. Of course, we're going to go through the technical definition of redundancy here in just a minute. So, but I want you to remember this economy of thought. We want to do nothing if we don't need to do anything. We want to minimize the amount that we actually do things. So let's talk about what the assumptions that we need to make in order to fit this into the box of information theory, so we can start talking about redundancy in a slightly more nuanced way. So what we're going to do is we are going to think of our agent as a set of tubes, just like the internet. It's just a set of tubes. So there's going to be some set of fibers, and so these fibers, there's going to be a number of fibers f, and we are going to send a specific impulse, just an impulse down them at some rate r. Impulses are going to be expensive and we want to minimize them. This is the economy of thought. So there's going to be some rate r at which we either send or do not send an impulse. And this is going to be across all fibers f. And we're also going to have something that simplifies the mathematics called I, which is just the average number of impulses per second per fiber. So the whole idea here is we are casting the agent into in this idea of fibers. And we're going to talk about the codes that we can actually output. So we're also going to go through an example if this is not immediately clear to you. So these are the assumptions that we're making. And of course, what we're doing is deeply oversimplified. However, Barlow goes through and talks about how, although this is extremely simple, it's easy to go from simple to complicated if you just add steps and add things. But to go from complicated to simple is much harder. So we're just taking the most careful, simple, modest approaches to what we are doing as possible, which I absolutely adore. I think that's a little bit why Barlow was chosen for this, because Barlow is not only a really good writer, but I consider these modest steps to be so. It's a little bit careful. It goes a little bit slow, but at the same time, like it makes it a little bit more timeless, if that makes sense. Let's talk about this hypothesis real quick and cast it, this password hypothesis and casting it into this idea of information theory. So we want to introduce just a little bit of information theory. So if you're not familiar, the paper on Shannon and Weaver, which I think I have, there we go. This mathematical theory of communication. This doesn't say anything about Weaver, but whenever I googled it, this said it was Shannon and Weaver. So not sure what's going on there. Oh, maybe because the one he was talking about was a 49, and this is a 48. I don't know. Either way, let's go back to our paper, and here we are. So we are going to introduce the idea of information, redundancy, and messages, and so on. So a message, in our terms, is going to be composed of signals in the same way that an image is composed of pixels. However, these signals are going to be represented with respect to time, our rate r. An image is going to be organized with respect to space, of course. Like your pixel has one pixel directly above it, to the right, to the left, and down below. And you're really not allowed to change this up because otherwise it's going to be a different image. So we're going to have a message composed of signals. And we're going to have some rate that we just arbitrarily apply that we like, and some number of fibers. We can pick our favorite number. And we are going to talk about a code. A code is just going to be it's just going to be some kind of morphism, maybe an isomorphism or something like that, as we actually go down and talk about the way that we do these things. If you're not familiar with it, I really do recommend the paper that was just shown. Barlow also recommended it in 1961, so I maybe I'll make a video over that paper. Maybe I won't. I have no idea. I make no promises. So let's talk about information. Information is the quantitative attribute of a message if the prior probability of receiving it is known. So the whole idea is we're going to be taking this entropy right here, and they don't call it an entropy. They call it the average information of all messages. So here's the average information of all messages, where here's the information content, and here's the probability of actually having that thing, and here's our h. And so h is the actual information we're sending down the tube. And so here is some simplification to where we can talk about t, the average duration of messages, where this is going to come from the rate and just the length that we actually need to send the message. And we're going to have some capacity c. The capacity c is the greatest rate of flow of information that can be passed down to it. And so this is essentially all that we need. So we're going to have ct right here. I kind of flew through that, but it's all rather straightforward. We're going to have ct, which is the fastest information we could possibly stuff down this tube at once. We're going to have h. H is how fast we actually do it. So this is a measure of efficiency right here. Do you see how much we're actually doing compared to how much we possibly can do? And then we're going to introduce the idea of redundancy. Hold on. There we go. We're going to have the idea of redundancy. And this is just going to be 1 minus this ratio, 1 minus this efficiency ratio. And that's going to be it. And what we're going to want to do is minimize our redundancy. And so minimizing redundancy just means we have more efficient code. The more efficient the code is, the more we are using the technology that we have at our disposal. But this is going to be like the heart of the paper, that we want to minimize redundancy. Let's see, is there a better sentence that I can actually find? No, I can't. So minimizing redundancy is the way that we are actually going to start getting rid of information. This is the heart of the paper. This is the most important part. So before, whenever we introduce this idea of the passwords, what we're saying is that we want to just get rid of the information that doesn't have to do with the passwords. But here, with this redundancy minimization that we're trying to do, whenever we're going through it, we're trying to minimize the redundancy, and that says that we're just trying to make the most of the code that differentiates between our passwords. So we're just going to be accidentally, this is going to be just implicitly getting rid of all the information that doesn't have to do with the password specifically and differentiating between them. Do you see how just by wanting to reduce redundancy and by wanting to discern between discrete situations, discrete passwords, suddenly we are getting rid of information all on its own? This is the nuance that was lost on me last time. This is what I didn't understand that I learned from reading this paper. We want to minimize redundancy, and that is the method of how we get rid of a lot of information. We are trying to make the most of what we have, and whenever you do that, a lot of information just falls out automatically because of the way that we actually structure these things. So what we want to do is not get rid of information, but we want to reduce redundancy. And reducing redundancy accidentally is necessarily going to get rid of a lot of information. So let's go through. We're actually going to kind of fly through this. You're going to notice that we're on 9 of 18 right now, but the second half of the paper is more or less like solved problems, like problems that were a really big deal in 1961, but here in 2023, just if you're listening to this in 2023, you know that it's just not that inform not that important anymore. They're solved problems. So let's talk about the example that is given. And let's see, here's the maximum rate. And, oh, I've lost my place. Give me just 1 second. So we were looking at the capacity reduction and we want to economize the impulses. That's where I was. So I brought it up earlier that we want to economize these impulses because these impulses are going to be expensive. So we are going to scroll down and see just two binary inputs. We're just going to see an example of a set of coding that you could possibly have, and how we're going to code this to minimize to have this economy of thought, to have this minimization of impulses. Because you either send an impulse down the fiber or you don't. And the fibers, to send the impulse down the fiber is expensive, so we don't want to do that. There's two fibers, A and B, entering a relay, and two fibers, X and Y, leaving it. And so the whole idea is that there is either going to be an impulse on A, or there's not going to be an impulse on A. And having the impulse is capital, and not having it is lowercase. And same for B. So we can think of this as the environment showing you the information that you have. And then there's going to be the X and the Y. And of course, this is going to follow the exact same thing. There's not XY, and then there is X and Y. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to want to find the most common one between AB, well, these sets of AB, have A, have B, or not A, not B, or some combination of those two. And there's going to be a way to map it to X and Y. And of course, there's going to be factorial 4 ways, which is 24 ways that we could possibly set this up. But once we apply the economy of thought, we say that we want to take the most common thing, the commonest, and we want to allot that to not X and not Y. And then we want to take the most common and map that to the rarest output. So having something intrinsically is the thing with the most information. It's the rarest thing. And so that is going to be the way that we structure it. And whenever you structure it in this way for the economy of thought, you only have 2 of the 24 codes that are actually going to be valid for this situation. Now, there's still a few flaws with it. Some might say that it only tells you about the relative frequencies. There we go. It only reflects the relative frequencies. We have no idea if the most common thing or the least common thing has actually happened or not. We have no history. We can only tell you the relative probabilities of these specific things. Uh, However, there's a couple of other problems with that, but I do hope that this idea was at least made a little bit more clear with this A-B example and this XY example. As we scroll down, just to show it to you, they're going to talk about more complex inputs, which is to say that usually the environment gives you a little bit more than 2 bits. So it gets a little bit more complicated than that, and it's not just like combinatorically large. It's actually exponentially combinatorically large. It is just laughably large. And so Barlow is saying here, I have no idea how you actually do this. This is engineering difficulty. Of course, we're going to solve this many years later with backpropagation and all that kind of thing, to where we don't find the best code. We just find a good code. We find a local minima. So this idea is actually solved, and he talks about a way that predictions and speculations is mostly about, like, how are we going to solve what we eventually use backprop for? How are we going to solve what we eventually use convolutional neural networks for? And he talks about vision and that kind of stuff. So that is the vast majority of the paper. It is the idea that whenever we're getting rid of information, we're not we're not just getting rid of information. No, we are trying to minimize our redundancy. Redundancy minimization is the guiding idea behind how we're actually going to get rid of information. We're not just trying to get rid of information, we're trying to make the most of what we have, and that implicitly means that we're getting rid of information, not explicitly. I thought that was pretty cool. Uh, I guess that's the paper. I do hope that you enjoy it. Uh, have a good day.